Welcome everyone to the tips number 3 for CKAD and Kubernetes in general. And in this, I'm going to talk about briefly pods and container. So to understand pod and container, let me try to draw something in the screen. So if we just ignore all other components a Kubernetes typically needs to run, and focus on the primary basic element that is pod. And if we try to put a box like this, imagine that this is your pod. Now, Kubernetes doesn't require you to manage individual containers. You need to deploy pod with a container. So a pod can have a container one. Generally, we have one-to-one pod and container, P and C. But you can also have different containers within the same pod possible. So basically, you have one pod that is a boundary of one or more containers, and they use the same IP address, storage, etc. Right? And you can restrict, let's say, you can say that how much the memory and resources this container will use versus how much memory and resources this container will use, so that the pod is never actually over provision with a lot of workloads. So you can design as per your requirement. So basically, unlike if you work with, let's say, directly to Docker, you directly work with the container and its networking and its storage, etc. But here you do it inside a pod. So let's see how that experience looks like, right? So let me switch to my Karakoda environment. That something is running already, right? So I will just increase the font size so that it's visible well in the command prompt. And I use the alias Kubernetes. This is something I mistyped. Okay, so now this K is there. Now I say K get nodes just to make sure that there are nodes available. I kubectl, and then if I say k get nodes, then I get the node running at my screen. So which is saying the version 1.17, which is pretty close to what I intend to use, but no man doesn't matter. So at this point in time, I'm going to create a pod, a very simple pod. So I will say that I want to create a pod. So I will say k run busy and image busybox. So busybox is a Linux-based container. You can see the busybox container in Docker Hub, and you will know what exactly it contains. So that's the container, and I will use restart never so that it doesn't create deployment, and I will probably use a sleep just to make sure that it runs for at least 24 hours. Okay, so the pod is created. If you say k get pods, you will see the pod is running. Now, I want to see what exactly this pod is doing, right? Just to see the pod definition, or you use something called describe. So k describe pod and the pod name. So you can either say pod or PO, that works fine. And then I say busy. That's the name of the pod, right? So I say that, and you get to see the lot of content. So it's, let's start reading through it, right? So it says that the status is running. This is the IP address of the pod, and it talks about containers. You notice here it doesn't talk about single container. It talks about containers, but we have only one container, and it basically in a state of running. It started and it uses the image from Docker Hub, and that's the image name. That's a busy box, and this is the image ID it is using, right? So the image basically got downloaded, right? Successfully assigned that, and then it pulled the image from BusyBox from the Docker Hub, the name BusyBox, successfully pulled, created the container, and it is up and running. That's the description. If you describe the pod and say YAML, right? And you say O YAML, that means output YAML. That will basically, I will use get, not describe. So describe, I'll say get, and then you get the YAML. You basically see the generated YAML file, which you can reuse, right? So you get to see something called status, which is basically the current status of the thing that you don't need while you create the pod, but you have got something like metadata, the API version v1, the kind pod, the metadata talks about things like levels, namespace, etc., which we did not discuss yet. But the most important thing I wanted to talk about inside the specification is the containers again, multiple containers. The first one, it's a list. In YAML, you start a list with dash with a space, and then you say that this is the arg, which is this is the command which is running when the container started. So that's why the container will keep running for 24 hours. And then the image is busy box. And the condition of pulling the image, always, you can also say that if that is locally available, I will not pull the image. I will use the local image so to save the bandwidth, right? And you can see that it also has got a volume mounts, right? So it basically does mount something, but it's not a storage, it's a service account which does come to this container as a volume mount, and we will talk about it later. And then the cluster first DNS got assigned. So these are all things which got assigned. Now, what is most important is that you can, instead of writing the command in the command prompt like this, where we created a pod called busy. If I want to create a pod called busy2, and then I use the same syntax, but this time I'll use try run equals client and then o YAML. What happens? It basically says that. So let me see why it did create it. So I should have a dry run. Let me just say, now what I wanted to do is that I wanted to create, it says, still says created. Okay, so what I wanted to do is that basically I wanted to do create a pod, but I don't want to actually create the pod. So before the sleep, I need to put the dry run, not after the sleep. So what I wanted to say, dry run equals client o YAML. So it will be in YAML format output, right? So client is an invalid syntax. So I'm using the older version. In version 2.0, it basically works. So you can see that sometimes when you use the older version, some of the new commands don't work. So I use v1.20 where dry run equal to client is the expected behavior, but things might change. That's what you need to live with if you use older version. So you see that that's the YAML. That's the only YAML I need. So if I, let's say, save this file into a file called pod.yaml, it basically will come to this pod and then it named as busy3, right? So what I can now do is that I can just edit the pod or see or change some of the things I want to change. And this shows me the name of the pod as busy3, which might not work because I already have a pod here. So I make it 31 and then argument sleep image busy box. I don't need this creation time. So I can remove this line creation time, right? So I can just go here and say, go to normal mode, delete this line. I don't need this restart status because that's what the generated object will talk about. I just need this much information. And then if I come out, I can go ahead and run this file to create a container. So to run create a container, what you need that k create -f and the file name that is pod YAML. If you do that, the busybox 31 will get created. So if you say k get po, then you see the 31 is created. So with this, thank you very much, and I will come back with more detail.